Thank you, and welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Gary, and I'm especially delighted to welcome you to White Christmas. I feel like I should be in a Santa Claus outfit, and you should be coming down sitting on my knee. I can tell there are several bad boys and girls here, but in any case, not to worry about that. You have to, tonight, take out your 1950s lenses, put them on. Ladies, I hope you're wearing your crenolines and your big skirts, and gents, I hope you all have crew cuts, and I hope you're all wearing I Like Ike pins, and so that you're ready to celebrate this 1950s confection White Christmas. You know, really, the show tells itself. It's a famous story. You've seen it on film. You know the song. It is the most famous song ever recorded. It sold 150 million records. It's in the Guinness Book of Records as the most beloved song in the world. But what I want to do is to spend quite a bit of time talking about Irving Berlin. You know, Irving Berlin, of course, is the genius behind the words and music. His life is a phenomenal rags to riches story. Keep in mind, he was born in 1888. He lived to be 101 years old. And in a 60-year period, he wrote over 1,500 songs. He wrote 19 Broadway musicals, 18 beloved Hollywood movie films, and then, of course, he gave us anthem songs for every occasion. So whether it's Easter Parade or White Christmas, whether it's God Bless America, whether it's There's No Business Like Show Business, he really covered everything. And keep in mind, he's one of those special writers. He not only wrote brilliant melodies, but he wrote very memorable lyrics that have stayed with us and are a part of our whole cultural texture. He made an enormous contribution. He was a patriot. He came here as a very poor immigrant, and he loved his country. You will see that very strongly, of course, in the telling of White Christmas. And again, you know, he had a 60-year marriage and was devoted as a family man. And so in almost every way, he becomes the sort of symbol of what it is to be a good American. And he was really extraordinary, and he left us with this phenomenal legacy. I had this wonderful opportunity in the last several weeks. I went back and watched all of the old Irving Berlin movies. And I mean, they are extraordinary. I mean, the stories are paper thin. I mean, you know, they're sort of written on cellophane, doesn't matter. What's there, of course, are these lyrics and melodies that just move directly into our hearts. He always said from the very beginning, I write for the masses, and he certainly knew how to do that. When Jerome Kern sort of gave an estimate of Irving Berlin's contribution, he said, Irving Berlin is not part of American music, he is American music, and of course he is. But let me go back to the beginning and just show you things in his life that you will see very strongly reflected in the music, in the sentiment, in the ideas that you'll be feeling in White Christmas tonight. Okay, so we go back. He was born in 1888 in a very remote part of Russia. His father was a cantor. His earliest memory, he was one of 8 children. His earliest memory was being in a ditch with his family, quivering while their house was burned down at age 5. There was tremendous anti-Semitism in Russia at that period. And, you know, through very, very difficult maneuvering, they were finally able to find their way to America, where they literally lived on the Lower East Side of New York in absolutely a basement hovel. It didn't even have a window. But Irving Berlin said, you know, I didn't really realize how poor we were or how difficult life was because there was so much love in our family. And keep in mind, that sense of family will permeate all of his work, and it's there in all of his songs. I mean, we say, oh, perhaps this song is sentimental, but what I have to say is thank God for sentiment. And I mean, he writes about a gentler time where values of family and love of country and regard for other people are exceedingly important. All of his life, he would remain a liberal and fight for liberal causes and march with the idea of stopping segregation. He was an incredible spirit and had a great soul. Okay, so as a child, he came to America. One of his first jobs, I mean, they lived in absolute abject poverty. And so at a very early age, he sold newspapers for William Randolph Hearst. Well, you know a lot about that. He literally was a newsie. But what he learned by being a newsie is that he could sell many more newspapers by singing the headlines rather than by speaking the headlines. So from the earliest age, Irving Berlin understood that music was his way out of this horrific ghetto that he was living in. And so whether it started with him hawking newspapers, he told his mother, he confided when he was about 12 years old, that his life's dream was to be a saloon singer. Well, happily, he went way beyond that. But he did at one point, actually at age 13, his father tragically died. His father was a man of great substance and character, and in Russia and in the Jewish community, he was very highly regarded. And of course, when he came as an immigrant to America, I mean, there was no place for him. And he had a very difficult time helping to support his family. And tragically, he died when the children were all very young. So all of the children went to work. So this idea of deprivation and value, I mean, listen carefully to the songs tonight. Everything speaks about value and what's important. And it isn't really the money that's important. It's the love and the respect we have for one another that's important. So at this very early age, at age 13, literally, Irving Berlin felt that he couldn't be a burden to his mother, who was desperately trying to keep the family together. His sisters were rolling cigars. That's what immigrant children did very often, especially young girls. And they would come home every night and take the money they had made and put it in their mother's apron. She would stand at the door and they would drop money in her apron. And Irving Berlin was always very ashamed that his sisters were making more money than he was. So he finally decided to leave the family at age 13 and to go out and try and find a life for himself. Keep in mind, this is a child who had a third grade education. He would have to invent himself. And the end result, of course, of what he did was he found his way through music. He worked in this little sleazy night spot called Pelham's Cafe in Chinatown. And it was a very notorious place. Upstairs there was a bordello, and it was an outrageous place. But he found his place as a singing waiter. And he found his niche immediately by taking other people's songs and changing the lyrics, making them better, funnier, pertinent, offbeat, iconoclastic sometimes. And these kids would only have a few minutes. They'd be waiting on tables, and finally it would be your turn to sing, and you'd go to the center stage, sing, and people would throw money on the floor. And Irving Berlin learned very early on, you've got to get the attention right away, and you've got to keep it. And so that's what he did both in his presentation and in the lyrics he was writing to other people's songs. Finally, he had this urge to be a songwriter, but he didn't know how to write music, and he didn't know how to read music. Keep in mind, he never did. At one point, at the height of his career, he wanted to go back and study composition, and he finally said, I don't have time to study music, I'm too busy writing it. And so but the way he wrote it was what ultimately would be so fantastic. When he became successful, he would hum the melody line he would always have an assistant working for him. It was always there on 24-hour call, and they were called music secretaries. And what they did was he would hum the melody line, and they would very quickly write it down. But then he would go back and create very complex harmonies, very complex musical, sophisticated musical ideas, and he would hum it. So can you imagine having a job where you were hummed to for 12 hours a day? And often he liked to work very late at night. But here we are, he's back at the very beginning, doesn't have money to have anyone help him with this. So in desperation, he would stay at Pelham's Cafe when it would close at 6 a.m. in the morning, and he taught himself how to play the piano. But he could only play on the black keys. So all of his original songs were written in F sharp. Now, this is very limiting, especially when you're going to write 1,500 songs in your lifetime. And so very early on, he knew that he needed help in doing this. When he made his first money, keep in mind, his first great success happened in 1911 when he wrote an instrumental version called Alexander's Ragtime Band. Now, that was put into a show in New York, a review. And in New York at this time, reviews very often would put a new song in, and if it didn't work, they'd throw it out, and a week later, they put in another song, et cetera, to always keep the review fresh. And so he wrote this music for Alexander's Ragtime Band. And the impresario who was running the theater said, you know, it's not getting very big applause. We're going to cut it by the end of the week. So in desperation, he wrote lyrics for it. And of course, it went on in 1911 to be the absolute musical phenomena of the early new century. It created a dance craze. Mothers took their daughters to convents saying, never let this child learn how to do the ragtime. That old line, what's going to become of us? Look at our children. Well, we said it all those years ago. And Alexander's Ragtime Band set off this craze, this dance craze, this ragtime craze, and the song would become an international hit. So almost overnight, Irving Berlin went from being an absolutely unknown, poverty-stricken young man to being one of the most celebrated writers of his day. And he would live up to it for the next 60 years. One of the first things he did with the money he made was he bought a piano that could transpose. They were made in England at the time, and there were a series of levers. So if he created his song in F major or in F sharp, he would then be able to pull some levers and transpose it to another key, a more harmonious key or a more commercial key, etc. And so that would start him on his way. So he went from that first great success through a string of 60 years of enormous successes. The following year, he met a young woman. Now keep in mind, up to this point, he had lived in a very sort of celibate way. I mean, he worked all the time only on his music and only on making minimal amounts of money to help support his family and especially his beloved mother. And so the end result is, after a year of this tremendous success, he was not out celebrating, drinking champagne, being the toast of Broadway. He was writing more music. And he met a young woman that he fell in love with and married. They went to Cuba for their honeymoon. She contacted malaria, and 6 months later, she died. It was a horrific and devastating. I mean, this young man who had been through so much in his own young life, suddenly now the love of his life would die. And he felt that he would never write again. And it was his brother-in-law who said to him, the only way you can work out your grief is through music. So use music as a way of filling that pain, of filling that emptiness, of filling that hole in your heart. And so he wrote a song called Since You Left Me. And it was his first ballad, and it sold 1 million copies. And from that point on, he came back to life and worked endlessly. He would do this all of his life. When he lost his beloved mother, all of his life he kept a photo of his mother on the bedside table. And when he lost her in the 1920s, he wrote a song honoring her also. The idea of losing someone and then finding the answer and the balm in music would always be his way of dealing with it. And so the end result is that in this next period, right after his wife's death, we of course entered the First World War. And this was an opportunity for him to express his tremendous patriotism, which you will also see in White Christmas. and he carried that with him all his life. He wrote a musical to be performed by soldiers, and it was called Yip Yip Yap Hank. And in 1917, and it became a great hit. In that, he wrote my theme song, which is "I Hate to Get Up in the Morning." So now you know all my secrets. You can't work in the theater and get up early. Come on. So in any case, he sang that song all his life, and even in the Second World War, he would write another musical called "This Is the Army." And he literally would travel with the army, literally at all of the battlefields, all through Europe for 4 years. He traveled over, I think, 180,000 miles in that period, putting his life at risk every day, performing for the troops. But his signature song was always, "I Hate to Get Up in the Morning." When he did that in World War I, just to go back to that story, he became a citizen, and he was so proud to become a citizen, and he wanted to serve his country, so he asked the army what he could do, but he was already 30 years old, so they decided the best thing he could do would be to write songs. But what he did was, he took the royalties from his songs during this period and gave them to the Army Relief Fund for Army family members who were displaced because their loved ones were overseas or had died in the war. So always, he was enormously patriotic. He did the same thing during the Second World War. So that sense of being proud of being American stayed with him all of his life. Okay, so as we move then into the 1920s, again, to show you the brilliance of this man, he was so interested and so prolific at this point and just turning out so many songs, he was finding a formula that in the musical theater at the time, it would really be his music that would hold the show together. And so he literally built a theater in New York called the Music Box Theater, which in my mind is the jewel of all of the Broadway houses. It's a magnificent little theater in New York. But he built that, and for the first 4 years of the 1920s, every year he would create a new revue to play in the Music Box. It subsequently is now one of the most desirable theaters to be used for small shows because the acoustics in the space are so incredible. In 1925, he would meet a woman that would change his life. He had gone all these years being a widower, 13 years, and a young man, and enormously successful, and certainly one of the greatest catches in New York. But he had no interest in the world of showgirls or all of that. He was so serious about his writing. And in 1925, he met a young heiress whose father had laid a transatlantic cable, and she came from an Irish-American family. Her father was a great aristocrat, and his name was Mr. Mackay, and he was a great aristocrat in New York society at the time, and he was absolutely horrified and deeply anti-Semitic in his feeling about his daughter marrying a Tin Pan Alley writer. Ironically, if I could pause, that after the crash in the 20s, when the Great Depression happened and the father lost all his money, he did have to rely on that same little Tin Pan Alley composer to bail him out and keep him in this fantastic lifestyle that he had had all of his life. So 3 years after this marriage, and also to note the marriage, I love this idea, the father sent his daughter, her name was Ellen, to Europe so she'd forget this no account. And so she was doing the grand tour of Europe, and she was not allowed to receive letters from Irving Berlin, but no one said anything about Irving Berlin writing songs for her that she could hear literally everywhere in the world. And he wrote a song for her called Always, which of course is one of the great love songs that's played at weddings endlessly and christenings and anything that has to do with love. And so, and he also gave her the royalties to that song, which I can tell you she spent freely all of her life. Irving Berlin always said about his 60-year marriage to Ellen was that, especially at Christmas, she loved to give extravagant gifts. And he said, I couldn't curb her, not buying things. I just had to work that much harder. So that was his theory about dealing with an extravagant wife who had an unlimited expense account who exceeded it. So that's how he dealt with that, in that same sort of gentle way that you hear in all of those lyrics in the show you're going to be hearing today. Of course, what happened at the end of the 20s, two major things would happen that would affect music, especially in the musical theater. One, Showboat opened, and that would transform everything about music. And all those old writers who wrote in the 1910s through the 1925, who were writing just sort of frivolous, silly songs with no real plot to the musicals, suddenly their careers would all be over, because Showboat would suddenly say, here is a musical of enormous substance using an operatic score, dealing with racial issues and contemporary issues. So it would literally transform what would happen on Broadway. And so most of the contemporaries who worked with Irving Berlin would fade away at this period. Irving Berlin would adjust and move into the 1930s following the requirements of a groundbreaking show like Showboat. Okay, the Great Depression happened, but luckily again for Irving Berlin, another point for you to remember, Irving Berlin was enormously savvy as a business person. Very early on, when he wrote his first song, when he was working at the Pelham Cafe, another man wrote the music because Irving Berlin couldn't write down notes. And so someone else wrote the music, and Irving Berlin wrote the lyrics, and it was called Marie from Sunny Italy. And don't rush out and buy it. It's not a great song, but it did give him his first money. And ironically, it really gave him his name. His name was Israel Balin. And when the sheet music came out, it said, I, Berlin. And so he took the name Irving Berlin based on that mistake. But in any case, what he learned was you can make so much more money if you write both the music and the lyrics. And then he also discovered if you publish it, you make even more money and you control your own material. So he is one of the only great commercial composers who owned his own publishing company. And so he always owned the rights to everything he wrote. He didn't have to go through publishers, or he didn't have to go through lawyers to get the rights to use them. He would do this same thing in the 1930s when he went to Hollywood, and he went to work for RKO. And he said, I will only work for you. By this point, he's at absolutely the height of his power. He's the most successful songwriter in America, certainly. And when he went to Hollywood, he said, the only way I will do this is if you give me 10% of the gross, and if you give me my total control of the song. He had had one experience in Hollywood before this. When he first went, he went to Hollywood at the end of the 1920s. He wrote a show called Coconuts with the Marx Brothers, and it was a great success on Broadway. It was turned into a wonderful film. Right after that, he did another film, and he didn't have control of the film. And he wrote 10 songs for the film. And when the film was released, there was only one Irving Berlin song in the film. And he said, this will never happen to me again. So when he went to RKO, he said, I'm going to have complete control of my songs. Keep in mind what this did. You know the great song, White Christmas. I mean, the musical you're seeing has that song, White Christmas. But that song was really written in 1942. And it appeared, first of all, in a movie musical called it's called Holiday Inn, and in Holiday Inn they sang that Bing Crosby sang White Christmas, and of course it would become the most famous song in the world. But it meant all those years later, in 1954, when the movie was going to be made of White Christmas, he could take that song out of another movie and reuse it. And he did that all of the time. Songs like There's No Business Like Show Business appear in countless films because he owned them and he had the rights to them, and the movies had no control over what he did with his songs. When he did that wonderful film of Holiday Inn, he also used Easter Parade, and as you remember, that movie is about all of the holidays, and so he literally wrote a song for every holiday, including a very sort of notorious song about Lincoln's birthday that was called Abraham, and when Bing Crosby sang it, he was in blackface, and it's a very startling moment to see in that movie. But in any case, he had this phenomenal ability to totally control his music, and he kept it that way all of his career. In the war years, in the 40s, of course, he dedicated all of those years to working for the armed forces with This Is the Army. But when he came home exhausted from the war and exhausted from all of that extensive travel, he immediately wrote Annie, Get Your Gun, which of course established him as the greatest composer of Broadway in that post-war period. And it lived up to the standards of Oklahoma and Carousel. So again, I want you to keep seeing how he kept adjusting himself. He moved from ragtime to jazz to swing to pop. He was amazing. He was a chameleon who could reinvent himself with everything. And then, of course, the 50s were really the high point of his career. This is when White Christmas would happen as one of the most beloved holiday movies ever. He would do a brilliant version of Call Me Madam that played both on the stage, and it was Ethel Merman's greatest screen performance. If you see only one of his old movies, look at Call Me Madam, it's wonderful. And then he followed it with There's No Business Like Show Business. And let me tell you, Marilyn Monroe did know how to make We're Having a Heat Wave really sizzle in that movie. It was really quite extraordinary. So this was an extraordinary career for a man that would pass through all these years. I just want to tell you a couple of other little things about what a survivor he was. Early on, when he married his second wife, he had a son 3 years into the marriage, and he was so delighted he would ultimately have 3 daughters, but he was so delighted to have a son. And 3 weeks after the birth, on Christmas morning, they found the little child dead in his crib. And again, he pulled himself together and would answer these issues in writing music. And so there's the soul that we feel in his music, and there's a difference between sort of saccharine sentiment and real feelings. And he always connected to the deepest level with these feelings. It's always surprised me that there has never been a musical about the life of Irving Berlin, because it is such really an extraordinary life. Okay, so what we're left with now is the show you're seeing. And first of all, the song that he wrote, White Christmas, he was separated from his family in 1942. They were back in New York, and he was a very profound family man, and holidays were very important to him. Even though he was born and raised in the Jewish faith, his wife was Irish and Catholic, so they celebrated everything. Every holiday was treated. But he was alone, and he went to La Quinta Resort, which is near Palm Springs, and he took a cabana, and he was so lonely for his family that he wrote the song White Christmas. And it is said in his biography that he woke up his assistant and started humming frenetically, and the poor assistant is writing everything down. And Irving Berlin said, "This is probably the greatest song of my career." And he said, "No, this is the greatest song ever." And it would be then White Christmas. He actually had that right. One other wonderful little story. In the war years of the First World War, everyone was writing patriotic songs. And he wrote a song, and his advisors said to him, "Why don't you put this away? Everybody's writing patriotic songs. Now is not the time." So he put it away for 20 years. And in 1938, Kate Smith called him and said, "I'm looking for a song to sing at Armistice Day." And of course, it's God Bless America. And people felt so strongly about that song and loved that song so deeply. Remember, it was the song that was sung most often after the September 11th massacre that happened in New York. But there was such a strong movement that they wanted to make it our national anthem. And it was Irving Berlin who went to Congress and said, no, don't even consider it. You have an absolutely perfect national anthem. It will always remain what it is. And of course, it's still a song that touches us all very deeply and touches our sense of patriotism. So he wrote that song in 1942. It was immediately put into Holiday Inn, which was an enormous success. And then all those years later, in 1954, he would come up with the idea again of doing another Christmas story, calling it White Christmas, featuring that song. Ironically, The song won an Academy Award in 1942, so it couldn't be considered again when the film was done in 1954. There are a couple of very funny, quick little stories about the music in that show. You know the song Sisters that was done so brilliantly by Rosemary Clooney and Vera Ellen. Well, in real life, Vera Ellen never sang, and so she was always dubbed by someone. And if you followed Vera Ellen through all her career, her voice changed so dramatically, and no one ever paid any attention to it. But so Rosemary Clooney sang both parts in Sisters. But when it was released as a movie soundtrack, as a record, it couldn't be released because she had a contract saying she could only work with another studio. So Peggy Lee had to sing the song. So it found many variations in the telling of the story. So you're in for a great treat, and all I can tell you is have a really Merry Christmas, and thank you very much. He had to sing the song, so it found many variations in the telling of the story. So you're in for a great treat, and all I And no one ever paid any attention to it. But so work with another studio. So Peggy Lee had to sing the song. So it found many variations in the telling of the story. So you're in for a great treat, and all I So Peggy Lee had to sing the song. So it found many variations in the telling of the story. So you're in for a great treat, and all I work with another studio. So Peggy Lee had to sing the song. So it found many variations in the telling of the story. So you're in for a great treat, and all I